A widow asked for a daughter. What happened next left him in shock. The sun hung over the Wyoming plains like a white-hot hammer, beating down without mercy. Jesse Calder felt the full weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Strapped to his aching back was his daughter, Ellie, a small, heavy bundle, barely 4 years old, her breath shallow and ragged. Her skin burned like a branding iron against the nape of his neck. Jesse had been walking for 3 agonizing days. His boots had worn clean through, and every step tore at the raw skin beneath them. He squinted at the horizon, searching for anything that might pass for a miracle. It was 1888. The brutal winter before had been a slaughter, millions of cattle dead in the suffocating snow, an entire way of life buried with them. Jesse had already lost everything once. Locusts had taken his farm in Nebraska. Fever had taken his wife, Anna. All that remained was Ellie. His heartbeat, the only reason his legs kept moving. In the shimmering distance, a small ranch house wavered like a mirage. A woman stood in front of it, motionless, wearing a blue dress that matched the terrifying vastness of the sky. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, and she watched his stumbling approach with eyes like flint. Jesse stopped at the edge of the dusty yard, careful not to frighten her. A man with nothing is too often mistaken for a man who'll take anything. He lifted a trembling hand to tip his sweat-stained hat. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he managed, his voice like rusted hinges grinding in the wind. The woman didn't move. She studied him, a ghost coated in the grime of 1,000 miles, then let her gaze drop to the small, limp girl strapped to his back. Ellie's eyes were shut tight, her pale little hand clutching the frayed collar of her father's shirt. "You're a long way from nowhere, stranger," the woman said. Her voice was steady, sharp, carrying the granite strength of someone who had learned to survive entirely on her own terms. "I'm looking for honest work," Jesse said, legs trembling as he forced one more step forward. "I can mend any fence the wind knocks down. I can break the wildest horse you own. I can do whatever you need, ma'am." He paused, throat tightening as he glanced back at his daughter. "I don't need much in the way of coin. Just a corner for my girl to rest her head, and a little milk to keep the life in her." The woman studied him, searching his face for the truth. She noted his hands, cracked and bloodied from the road, and the way he angled his body to keep the child shaded from the sun. A heavy silence settled between them, thick as the heat itself, broken only by the wind hissing through dead buffalo grass, the loneliest sound a man could hear. "My name is Margaret Doyle," she finally said. Hope flickered in Jesse's chest. "Jesse Calder, ma'am. From Nebraska." Margaret stepped down off the porch, moving with a tired kind of grace, dust curling around her hem. She didn't look at Jesse's desperate face, she looked straight at the child. Ellie's eyes cracked open, dark and clouded with fever, holding a wisdom no 4-year-old should ever have to carry. Margaret reached out and touched the back of her fingers to the girl's forehead. "She's burning up," Margaret whispered, her voice softening for the first time. "Yes," Jesse said, his chest twisting like a knotted rope. "She's been fading since we left the last watering hole." Margaret's eyes returned to Jesse, her expression unreadable, hard as iron. "I don't need a ranch hand," she said flatly. The words dropped Jesse's stomach into a pit with no bottom. His knees buckled, the world tilting, and he began to turn back toward the empty horizon. "Wait," Margaret called, the words slicing through the air. He stopped, breath catching. She looked him dead in the eye. "I don't need a man to mend my fences," Jesse Calder. "But I do have a price for the milk and for the bed." Jesse's pulse hammered in his ears. He was ready to trade anything to save his child. "I want a daughter," Margaret said, her voice breaking for the first time. The words landed like a physical blow. Jesse's grip tightened on the straps of Ellie's carrier until his knuckles went white. "Ma'am," he managed, praying he'd misheard. "You heard me," Margaret said, chin lifting in defiance. "I want a daughter to fill this empty house, not to replace what you've lost, never that. I only want to love her as if she were my own. If you stay, that's the price of your survival." A primal fear rose in Jesse's chest. Was she trying to buy his own flesh and blood? Was this the cruelty of the frontier finally coming to claim his last treasure? I won't give her up, Jesse growled, his voice low and dangerous, protective instinct flaring like wildfire. I'm not asking you to give her up, you fool, Margaret snapped, glancing back at the silent, hollow house behind her. I'm asking for a family. I'm asking for a reason to get up in the morning. The winter of '87 took my husband, Thomas. It took my hope and buried it under 10 feet of ice. It took the children we dreamed of but never got to hold. She stepped closer, eyes suddenly bright with pain. You want a job and a life. I want a daughter to love, and something worth leaving behind. Stay here. Work this land until your hands bleed into the soil. But let her be mine, too. Jesse stood in stunned silence, searching her face for malice and finding only a loneliness that mirrored his own, the shared language of the broken. She needs medicine, Margaret, he said, using her name for the first time. I have herbs and willow bark in the pantry, she replied. And a feather bed that hasn't been slept in for a year. He looked down at Ellie's flushed, fever-crimson face. There was no choice left to make. All right, he whispered. We stay. She's yours to love. Margaret didn't smile, but the tension eased from her shoulders. Bring her inside. Quickly. The house smelled of cedar, beeswax, and dried lavender, clean, quiet, a sanctuary. Margaret led them to a small sunlit bedroom where a handmade quilt, a mosaic of colorful scraps stitched with obvious love, covered the bed. Jesse laid Ellie down gently, she groaned, and the sound broke something in him. Margaret moved with purposeful tenderness, bringing a basin of cool spring water and bathing Ellie's face with a linen cloth, the ancient, practiced motions of a mother tending her own. Jesse stood in the doorway feeling like an intruder dragging in the world's filth. Go to the barn, Margaret said without looking up. There's a cot in the tack room. Wash yourself at the pump. I'll bring stew once she's settled. He nodded and slipped into the fading light. Once he was gone, Margaret closed the bedroom door, sat beside Ellie, and cried without a sound, the first tears she'd allowed herself in over a year. At the pump, the cold water felt like baptism as Jesse scrubbed the dust of 2 states from his skin, turning over the strange, beautiful, terrifying bargain he'd just made. Out here, life was a brutal currency, people did desperate things just to see another sunrise. But this felt different. This felt like the start of something sacred. That night the wind howled like a banshee across the plains. 3 times before dawn Margaret changed the cool cloth on Ellie's forehead. Twice her breathing grew so faint that Margaret leaned in, terrified, and prayed until her knees went numb. In the barn, Jesse ate the stew Margaret had brought, rich, salty, warm in a way his stomach hadn't felt in weeks, and thought of Anna, of how she would have loved the stars out here, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. A single tear slid down his weathered cheek. Men on the frontier were told tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. But loneliness was heavier than any mountain. By morning the sun rose gold and violet. Jesse crossed to the main house, heart-hammering, and found Margaret in the kitchen feeding Ellie spoonfuls of broth. The girl looked different, her eyes were clear, the fire in her skin finally broken. She turned the corner in the night, Margaret said without looking up. Thank God, Jesse breathed, sagging against the doorframe. You'll find tools in the shed, Margaret said, businesslike again. The north fence is trampled. Start there. Work till sundown. Jesse threw himself into the labor with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years, grueling work under a punishing sun, the ground packed hard as stone, but it felt magnificent to use his body for a future instead of a retreat from a grave. The weeks folded into a steady rhythm. Jesse worked from first light to the emergence of the stars. Mending the sagging barn, reinforcing corrals, digging a new well that struck a vein of water that tasted like life itself, nursing the surviving cattle back to health. Inside the house, Margaret took over Ellie's world, teaching her letters with a charred stick on the porch, mending the torn sleeve of Jesse's work shirt without a word about it. He noticed the careful stitches the next morning and smiled for the first time in years. Ellie looked up and laughed. Mama fixed it. Margaret taught her to gather eggs without cracking a single shell and sang old, haunting songs to her in the purple twilight. Watching from the shadow of the barn, Jesse heard his daughter laugh, a sound he'd feared he'd never hear again, and saw her cheeks flush with healthy color as she trailed Margaret like a devoted shadow. It stung some small, selfish corner of his heart to feel like he was losing the one thing that was purely his. But then he saw the joy in his daughter's eyes, saw that she was finally, truly safe, and felt his own broken heart begin, slowly, to knit itself back together. One afternoon a group of riders appeared at the gate, men from the nearby settlement of Larkspur Junction, eyeing Jesse with narrowed suspicion. "Who are you, stranger?" one barked, a mountain of a man with a tin star pinned crookedly to his chest. "I'm the ranch hand," Jesse said, holding his ground. "Since when does Margaret Doyle hire drifters?" the sheriff pressed. "She's been a lone widow since Thomas passed in the ice." Margaret stepped onto the porch, jaw set, Ellie tucked safely behind the folds of her skirt. "He's with me, Sheriff," she said, voice like a whip. "He's a good man, and he works harder than any three of you put together." "Folks in town are talking, Margaret," the sheriff said, and a couple of men behind him snickered. One spat near Jesse's boots. "A lone woman and a nameless drifter under one roof, it doesn't sit right with decent folk." Jesse's face burned with righteous anger, but he knew the cruel math of this world. A woman's reputation was her only real currency. "He is my partner," Margaret said, her voice ringing across the yard. The sheriff looked genuinely startled. "Partner? Or is he something else to you?" one of the men sneered. "That is none of your business, and certainly none of the law's," Margaret snapped. The men traded dark looks. They didn't care for her tone, or her independence, but they had no legal grounds to linger. "Just watching out for your interests, ma'am," the sheriff lied, before wheeling his horse around and leading the group away in a cloud of dust. When the silence settled again, Jesse turned to Margaret, heavy with guilt. "I should leave, Margaret. I'm bringing nothing but trouble to your door." She looked at him, really looked, and then at the daughter she'd claimed as her own. "You aren't going anywhere, Jesse Calder," she said firmly. "Let them wag their tongues till they fall out. They don't know what it is to be an empty house." Jesse stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Why did you really want a daughter, Margaret?" It was the question that had kept him up in the tack room for months. Margaret sat on the top step, smoothing her blue dress with trembling fingers, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I had a daughter once," she said quietly. "Her name was Emma. She was 3. She died in the terrible winter of 1886. The wood ran out. The coal ran out. The cold got in through the cracks in the walls like something alive. I held her against my chest until she went cold in my arms." Her voice never wavered, which somehow made it worse. But the grief in her eyes was a hole that could swallow the world. "I promised God I'd never let myself love anyone again. It hurts too much to lose them when winter comes. Then I saw you coming up that trail. I saw a father who'd walked through hell for his child, and a little girl fading for want of a mother. I didn't want to buy her, Jesse. I'm not a monster. I wanted to save myself from the silence." A lump rose in Jesse's throat as he understood, fully, that they were the same. Two broken, jagged pieces trying to find a way to fit. He saw the dignity in her grief and the courage behind her demand. The weeks turned into a golden, crisp autumn. Cottonwood leaves along the creek turned to shimmering gold, even as the memory of the terrible winter still lay over the territory like a shadow, and people braced themselves for what was coming. In Larkspur Junction, the rumors about the widow and the drifter only grew more poisonous. Some claimed Jesse was a wanted killer, others that Margaret had finally succumbed to prairie madness. One Sunday, needing supplies before the snows came, they decided to face the town together. Jesse drove the wagon, back straight. Margaret sat beside him, head high. Ellie rode in back, singing to a rag doll Margaret had sewn her. As they rolled in, the air turned cold with judgment. Women whispered behind lace fans, men spat in the dirt as the wagon passed. Inside the general store, the owner, a sour-faced man named Hargrove, served Jesse in heavy, insulting silence. Margaret went to look at Winterwool for a new coat for Ellie, where a woman in silk approached with a smile as sharp as it was fake. Eleanor Vance, the mayor's wife, a woman who fed on other people's misery. "Margaret," she said, dripping false pity, "we are all so terribly worried about your situation. Living out there, isolated, with that man." Margaret didn't look up from the bolt of fabric. "I'm perfectly fine, Eleanor. Mind your own house." But think of your reputation, dear. And that poor, stolen child, she ought to be with proper, Christian people. Margaret turned slowly. That child is loved with a ferocity you couldn't imagine, she said. She's fed, she's warm, she's cherished. Can you say the same for the orphans living in the alleys of this town? Eleanor's face went a deep shade of purple. She spun on her heel and scurried off. Jessie had just finished loading the last sacks of flour and grain, eager to leave before the tension snapped, when their path out of town was blocked. A knot of men stood in the street, the sheriff at the center, hand resting on his holster. Calder, the sheriff, barked. Jessie pulled hard on the reins, heart slamming. What is it now, Sheriff? We're just heading home. Telegram came in from the authorities in Nebraska, the man said. Man fitting your description is wanted for grand theft. The ground seemed to tilt under Jessie. I've never stolen a thing in my life, he said, voice like iron. Say a farmhand ran off with a prize horse and a bag of gold right around the time you disappeared from your county. That wasn't me. Jessie's frustration finally boiled over. I walked every mile to this state. Look at my feet. The sheriff didn't bother looking down. We're taking you in till the circuit judge can verify it. No. Ellie screamed from the wagon bed, scrambling up to throw her small arms around Jessie's neck. Margaret rose like a warrior queen of the plains. This is a lie, and a farce, she shouted at the gathered crowd. He has worked my land for months. He hasn't left my sight. Step down, Calder, the sheriff ordered, drawing his weapon. Jessie looked at Ellie sobbing into his shirt, at Margaret trembling with white-hot fury, and knew he couldn't fight a dozen armed men, not with his daughter close enough to catch a stray bullet. He climbed down slowly, and the men closed in, pinning his arms and shoving him toward the cramped town jail. I'll take care of her, Jessie. Margaret called after him as they dragged him away. I promise you. I won't let them touch her. The iron door slammed shut with a finality that felt like death. Alone in the damp, freezing dark, Jessie sat on the narrow bench with his head in his hands, wondering if this was how his long, bloody road finally ended, after all the miles and hunger and grief, the world simply refusing to let a man like him find peace. Hours crept by. In town, Margaret refused to leave, badgering the telegraph operator into sending a second message to Nebraska. Check again. Someone's made a mistake. He sighed but sent it anyway. Night fell, and the jail turned into a tomb of cold air. Then came the heavy thud of boots, the sheriff, sour-faced and irritated, fumbling with his keys. You're a lucky man, Calder, he muttered. What happened? Jessie's voice cracked. Second telegram came through an hour ago. Caught the real thief in Casper. He had the horse and the gold. Jessie stood, aching from head to toe with tension, and said nothing to the man who'd humiliated him. He walked out into the crisp night air to find the street empty, the wagon gone. His heart sank into the frozen mud. Had the town finally broken Margaret's spirit? Had she decided he wasn't worth the trouble? He started walking toward the ranch, 10 long miles off, not caring if his feet split open in his boots again. He'd walk the whole world over to find them. Then he heard it. The familiar click-clop of a horse, the creak of a heavy axle, a small lantern flickering in the dark like a fallen star. The wagon pulled up, the horses low-headed and spent. Margaret was driving, her face set and determined, Ellie fast asleep beside her wrapped in the quilt. Margaret stopped the wagon and looked at him. She didn't offer comfort or ask if he was all right, she simply held out her hand, palm up. Jessie took it, warmth flooding through him like something holy. It was the hand of a partner. An equal. A savior. Let's go home, Jessie, she said, soft as velvet. Halfway back, Ellie stirred, reaching out with sleepy hands, one finding Jessie, the other finding Margaret, and fell back asleep holding both. The rest of the ride passed in a kind of holy silence beneath a canopy of stars, the Big Dipper hanging low to guide them home. Back at the ranch, Jessie carried Ellie inside and tucked her beneath the scrap fabric quilt, watching her sleep a long while. She was his daughter by blood, and Margaret's daughter by choice, and the bargain that had begun in desperation had become something living and real. He found Margaret waiting at the kitchen table by a single candle. "I thought you wouldn't come back for me," he admitted. "Thought you'd be better off without the shadow I cast." "I told you once before, Jessie Calder," Margaret said, the candlelight dancing in her eyes. "I was an empty house in a dead winter. You and that girl filled the rooms with life again. I don't care about the rumors, or the trouble in town. I don't care if the whole world stands against us." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I want more than just a daughter now, Jessie." His breath caught. He looked at this fierce, iron-willed woman who had saved his child's life and, somewhere along the way, his own spirit too. "I'm just a drifter with nothing to my name but my word," he whispered. "You have everything I will ever need," she replied. Neither of them moved for several long heartbeats. Then Margaret smiled through tears, and Jessie rose, circled the small table, took her hands, and pulled her to her feet. In the deep quiet of the Wyoming night, he kissed her. Not with fleeting passion, but with promise, survival, and something close to reverence. Two souls who had weathered the same storm, finally finding shelter in each other. The winter of 1888 arrived with a terrifying roar, brutal and relentless enough to break lesser spirits. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind howled across the plains like something wounded. But inside the ranch house, the fire never went out. They were seasoned with stacked high-end food enough in the cellar, and for the first time in either of their lives, an abundance of love to go with it. Jessie and Margaret married that spring, wed by a traveling preacher. Ellie wore a dress of fine blue wool Margaret had bought her, and served as the flower girl, the light of both their lives. All of Larkspur Junction turned out to watch. Many remembered the day the stranger first walked into town carrying his daughter on his back. No one called him a drifter anymore. Years afterward, people still told the story of the man who came in off the trail, and the widow brave enough to take him in, but they told it without malice now, with something closer to wonder. They'd watched a family grow out of dust and ash, a ranch thrive while others around it crumbled. Jessie never forgot the road that had brought him there, the weight of Ellie on his back, the cold of the jail cell, the heat of her fever. But every time he looked at Margaret, he felt like the richest man alive. He had come asking for a job and a little milk, and instead had been handed a reason to live for the rest of his days. Family, it turns out, isn't only about the blood in your veins. Sometimes it's about the people who see you at your absolute worst and choose, with everything they have, to keep you anyway. It's about the hard bargains we strike just to survive the winter. And the grace that turns those bargains into something like an eternal blessing. The frontier is gone now, buried under the years. But the spirit of a family forged in fire and ice remains. Cherish the ones who stayed when the world told them to run. They are the true miracles in this wild, beautiful life.